Hi, my name is Bibek Adhikari. I am an English instructor. In today's class, we are going to solve the grammar portion of Unit 4, that is relative clauses. So let's begin. So we are going to study about relative clauses, but before that, we need to understand what relative pronouns really are. There are three distinct kinds of relative pronouns. They are subject, object, and possessive relative pronouns. In the subject relative pronouns, we have who, which, and that. The objective form of who is whom, or simply who. The objective form of which is which in itself, and the objective form of that is that. If you come at the possessive form, the possessive of who is whose, and the possessive of which is whose. And we also need to keep two things in mind. The first is who and whom are always used when we talk about people, and which is used when we talk about things. Sometimes that is used when we talk about people and even when we talk about things. So that can be used in multiple ways. We can use that when we are talking about people. We can use that when we are talking about things. So these are some relative pronouns. Now we will understand how these relative pronouns help us form relative clauses. So let us now study some of the basics of relative clauses. Now let us understand that relative clauses are post modifiers of a noun. Now that sounds complex, but it is not. So we will study some examples and we'll find out how does relative clauses post modify a noun. So it is all about, relative clauses are all about post modifying a noun. First, we use relative clauses to post modify a noun to make clear which person or thing we are talking about. In these clauses we have the relative pronoun who and that, correct? Now let us see the relative clauses as subject. Now the relative clauses are acting as subject. So if you look at the two examples, the first one is, isn't that the woman who lives across the road from you? So the first example is, isn't that the woman who lives across, right? And if you go to the second example, you would find the relative clause, the police said the accident that happened last night was unavoidable. So the accident that happened is the relative clause. Now the relative pronoun is the subject of the clause. That is why we do not repeat the subject, right? So we are talking about woman. So we don't say something like the woman who she lives across the road, or the tiger which it killed. Right, so we don't write like that. So these relative clauses are acting as the subject. These are also known as clauses, sentences, and phrases. Right, these are the subjects. So this acts as the subject. This is again acting as a subject. Now what are these subjects doing? These subjects are modifying a noun. Isn't that the woman? Woman is the noun, correct? Woman is the noun. Isn't that the woman who lives across the road from you? Now who lives across, or who lives simply, this is trying to post modify the noun, correct? Now let us see relative clauses as the objects. Okay, let's see these two examples. The first one is, have you seen those people who we met on holiday? Those people who we met. Those people who we met is the relative clause. You shouldn't believe everything that you read in the newspaper. So everything that you read, another relative clause. Sometimes we use whom instead of who when the relative pronoun is the object. Have you seen those people whom we met? Now this is also correct. Now the big question is, why should we use one and not another? So which is better, whom or who? The thing is, whom is more formal while who is casual. So you can say something like, have you seen those people whom we met on holiday? Fine, sounds very British, sounds nice. Have you seen those people who we met on holiday? Perfect, no problem. So you can use whom and who interchangeably, no objection in that. But sometimes what happens, we leave out the relative pronoun. And when the relative pronoun is object of its clause, we sometimes leave it out, and we can write the same sentence like this. Have you seen those people we met on holiday? Have you seen those people? So let's cut something out from the sentence. Have we seen those people? Now if we cut who, the sentence is still right. Have you seen those people we met on holiday? So this is what we call leaving out the relative pronoun. The relative pronoun is left out, correct? You shouldn't believe everything you read in the newspaper, so there's no need to write that. But if you write that, it's okay, no problem. The relative pronoun is the object of the clause, and in this case, the relative pronouns are acting as the objects, not as the subject, but as objects, correct? So we do not repeat the object. We do not say something like, have you seen those people who we met them on holiday, who we met them. So we don't say something like, have you seen those people who we met them. So no need to say them. We don't repeat the object. Now let's go to the third use. But before that bit, so let's wind up the concept. Let's review the concept. The relative clauses, not the clauses, the relative pronouns are acting as objects and they are not repeated. Pretty easy. Now let's go to the third use, or the third way in which relative clauses can modify a noun. The third use is object of a preposition. The third use is object of a preposition. When the relative pronoun is the object of a preposition, we usually put the preposition after the verb. So what is that? Let's find out. So the preposition after the verb. Let's look at these two examples. Who was the woman who you were talking to? Preposition after the verb. After verb comes the preposition. That's the house that my parents live in. After the verb comes the preposition. So preposition always comes after the verb. Now the relative clause is acting as the object of a preposition. Who was the woman who you were talking to? So this who is acting as an object of the preposition. That's the house that my parents live in. In this case, we repeat the relative clause because you see here's that and we have another that, here is who and we have another who, and it's perfectly fine. We are going to repeat the relative pronouns because the first one is not a relative pronoun, by the way. So who was the woman who you were talking to? So the second who is acting as an object. It is acting as an object to a preposition. Object to this one, this little thing called to the preposition. But when the relative pronoun is the object of a preposition, we usually leave it out. Now again we do the same thing. We leave out. Now let's cross. Who was the woman you were talking to? There's no need to write who. Who was the woman you were talking to? Perfectly fine example. That's the house my parents live in. That's the house my parents live in. In this case, the relative pronouns are left out because we don't need them, correct? Why should we write the relative clauses, relative pronouns twice? There's no point in doing that. Sometimes we use whom instead of who. You can say something like, who was the woman whom you were talking to? Sounds more formal, correct? So the relative pronouns are left out, and this kind of relative clauses are what we called. So what we call them? We call them reduced relative clauses. Reduced relative clauses. So these are reduced relative clauses. Let's go on studying some other uses of relative clauses. We are now going to talk about something called time and places. We'll understand how relative clauses are used when we talk about times and places. Time and places, I mean. Right, let us now study about how relative clauses are used when we talk about time and places. The first one is, we also use when with times and where with places to make it clear which time or place we are talking about. If you study the first example, Stratford-upon-Avon is the town where Shakespeare was born. So the town where is the relative clause. This is what we call the relative clause. Stratford-upon-Avon is the town where Shakespeare was born. Nice little town. Shakespeare was born there. Imagine Shakespeare being a kid, being in an English class. So how annoying would that be, Shakespeare in an English class and writing wrong sentences? Have you ever thought about that? Frankly, I haven't. Now let's go to the second example. England won the World Cup in 1996. It was the year when we got married. So it was the year when we got, or simply the year when. So this got is not necessary, by the way. We can simply write the year when. So England won the World Cup in 1996. It was the year when we got married. But we can leave out the word, the relative pronoun when. Now let's see if we can leave out relative pronouns and make these sentences reduced relative clauses. Let's see if we can do that. The first one is Stanford upon Avon is the town where Shakespeare was born. If we leave out where, the sentence would be something like Stratford upon Avon is the town Shakespeare was born. Is the town Shakespeare was born. Okay, sounds good. England won the World Cup in 1996. It was the year we got married. So there's no need to write these relative pronouns. In fact, these relative pronouns can be left out. These relative pronouns can be left out, and what we get is something called reduced relative clause. Like I said earlier, reduced relative clauses are better because they are uncluttered. They do not have unnecessary words, meaning they do not have unnecessary relative pronouns. Correct? That's why writers prefer writing in reduced relative clauses. They don't write something like it was the year when we got married. They simply write it was the year we got married. The basic rule of writing is your writing has to be uncluttered. It should be clean, and there should be no fat, Right, teachers of writing often say this. They say something like cut the fat. So what do you mean by the phrase cut the fat? It means remove unnecessary wordings. If you use a lot of there are, here are, I felt like that, I thought like that, I feel, I see, and these little because, and a lot of commas. If you use these dead phrases and dead metaphors and dead similes, your writing becomes really cluttered and it's kind of messy. So to remove that big chunk of dirt from your writing, all you have to do is you need to cut the fat. So cut the fat. Let's go to another use of relative clauses. Relative clauses are used to give some extra information. And how is that done? We use who, whom, whose, and which, but not that in relative clauses to tell us more about a person or thing. So let's write some examples. My uncle. So this is the sentence. Let's write another sentence. Alright, now let us study these two sentences. The first one is my uncle who was born in Hong Kong lived most of his life overseas. Now who was born in Hong Kong is the relative clause. I have read Orwell's 1984, which is one of the most frightening books ever written. So, which is one of the most frightening books ever written is the relative clause. Now let us see if we can remove the relative clauses as the subject of the clause. We cannot. But we don't say something like my uncle who he was born. We don't say that. So I have read George Orwell's 1984, which is one of the most frightening books ever written. Have you ever read George Orwell's 1984? Or Animal Farm? Or Shooting an Elephant? So these are some of the nice, books. You should read them. So they are about this world, the world is coming to an end and it's all dystopic and everything is falling apart. So pretty nice books. Frightening books, by the way. The thing that you should notice while giving additional information by the use of relative clauses is there should be a pair of commas or simply commas, not always a pair. So there should be commas because commas separate the additional information. And that is why these are called non-defining relative clauses. What are they called? Non-defining relative clauses. The clauses that we studied in previous slides are all defining relative clauses. Now the clauses, those are separated by commas, and those that give additional information are called non-defining relative clauses because they do not define something. They only give extra information. They are not defining the subject. Correct? So it is not something like this is defining, this clause is defining the uncle. Of course it is defining, but not in a direct way. It is only giving some extra information about the subject. That's why relative clauses, they pre-modify a noun. Let's study some more examples about this topic. Let's study these two examples. The first one is we saw the latest Harry Potter, which we really enjoyed, is the relative clause. The second one is my favorite actor is Marlon Brando, who I saw in On the Waterfront, another fantastic movie. So these two are the examples. Now we can use whom instead of who as in the object. We can say something like my favorite actor was Marlon Brando, whom I saw. Instead of who, we can write whom. It's perfectly okay to write whom here, whom I saw. So the thing is, the relative pronoun is the object of the clause, correct? And these are non-defining relative clauses. They do not define the subject, but they pre-modify the subject by providing some extra information about the subject. In this case, they provide extra information about the object. We do not repeat the object. We do not say something like, we saw the Harry Potter film, which we really enjoyed it. We don't say that it. My favorite actor is Marlon Brando, who I saw him. We don't say saw him, right? We do not repeat the object. Pretty easy. So these are also what we call non-defining relative clauses because they do not define. So let's talk about the quantifiers and the numbers with relative pronouns. The first one is he has 3 brothers, 2 of whom are in the army. I read 3 books last week, one of which I really enjoyed. So these underlined phrases are what we call the relative clauses. These are the relative clauses. And they're acting as the quantifiers and numbers with the relative pronouns. We often use quantifiers and numbers with relative pronouns. Some of the quantifiers that we use are many of whom, most of whom, one of which, none of whom, some of which, lots of whom, 2 of which. So these are some of the quantifiers we use while we are talking about relative clauses. So commas are here. So once again, they are non-defining relative clauses. Very good. Let's go to another use of relative clauses. Right. Now 2 more examples. Using which to give more information. He was usually late, which always annoyed his father. We've missed our train, which means we may be late. So using which to give some more extra information. Pretty easy. Right, this is how which is used to give more information. Pretty easy. There's a comma, so it is a non-defining relative clause. With this, we have come to end of today's class. Now it's time for homework. Your homework is pretty easy. All you have to do is research about relative clauses and write paper on it. Pretty easy. It's not like an academic PhD thesis or something. So all you have to do is you have to go to Google and type the words relative clauses. Some info will flow out, and out of all those information flowing, flooding out, all you have to do is find some good websites, read the materials. Let's say you don't like going to the internet, right? You can go to the library, go to your nearest library, find some books on English grammar, flip the pages, go to the precise page where there is the information about the relative clause, study some books and write an essay on it. So it's all about writing an essay. More like write an essay on relative clauses. What do you think about relative clauses? Write about that. With this, we have come to end of today's class. If you have any questions or suggestions regarding this video series, feel free to write us at learning@deerwalk.edu.np. Thank you.